Going through storms is just a part of life, right? Like whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, your life is going to have challenges. There's going to be storms that come up. And I don't know if you can relate, but something that often frustrates me is the fact that it seems like after we go through the storm, after a challenge is completed, a lot of times the issues don't stop. It's like there's these remnants or this debris or evidence of the storm's passing that linger. And sometimes those evidence and those remnants seem to take more of a toll on us than the initial storm did in the first place. So I want to talk just a little bit about a specific storm. So join me as we dive into just a small piece of the story of Noah and see how the storm and possibly the aftermath of the storm might have affected him. So even if you've never read Noah's story for yourself, you've surely heard about it somewhere. It's almost just as popular in pop culture as it is in the church world. So essentially, way back in the day, God had created the earth, things went awry with humans, and he kind of wanted to restart the earth a little bit. But he didn't want to destroy everything that he had created that was good. So he chose a good man, a righteous man named Noah, and asked him to build a boat, or told him to build a boat, a giant ark, and to bring all of these animals onto the ark. And God said, I'm going to send these rains for 40 days and 40 nights, and I want you to go on this ark, and you and your family, I'm going to save you, and I'm going to save these animals, and this is what's going to happen. So Noah did it. He was obedient. And I remember as a kid hearing this story in Sunday school and thinking, like, a floating zoo for 40 days? Amazing. How could you not want to do that? But in actuality, I'm sure it was not quite as fun as it was in my childhood brain. But what was really surprising to me was one aspect of the story specifically that I found when I read the story for myself as an adult. So I want to look just a little bit at Genesis 8. I'm going to read verse 1, but then I'm going to jump down to verse 13. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and livestock with him in the boat. He sent a wind to blow across the earth, and the floodwaters began to recede. Noah was now 601 years old. Well, that's old. On the first day of the new year, 10.5 months after the flood began, the floodwaters had almost dried up from the earth. Noah lifted back the covering of the boat and saw the surface of the ground was drying. 2 more months went by, and at last the earth was dry. Then God said to Noah, leave the boat, all of you, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Release all the animals, the birds, the livestock, and the small animals that scurry along the ground, so they can be fruitful and multiply throughout the earth. So Noah, his wife, and his sons and their wives left the boat. A couple things to call out here. First, the amount of time that Noah was actually on the boat. I always heard this story and just assumed after 40 days Noah got off the boat, but that is not even kind of true. So verse 13 actually says 10.5 months later, and then verse 14 says, and then 2 more months went by. So over a year, Noah was on this big, smelly, stinking boat with all of these animals. And then the other thing to call out is that the way it says God remembered Noah, and then later says, and then God said to Noah, okay, now it's time to get off the boat. The implication here is actually that God was silent the entire time that Noah was on the boat. I'm probably projecting here, but really I'm thinking, like, was Noah thinking like, okay, maybe tomorrow the waters will recede and I can get off the boat? Okay, well, that didn't happen. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe next week. Next week, it's surely going to happen. Surely I'm going to be able to get off this boat. Like, was he playing games with his mind? Like, okay, 40 days down. Like, did he have like hash marks on the wall of his ark, as he's like counting down the days? And then I would think like, was he thinking like, did I mishear God? He said 40 days, right? Like, did anyone else hear him say 40 days? Like, maybe he meant 40 days of rain and then 40 nights for the waters to recede. Like, maybe that's what God meant. And why is he not speaking? Did I misunderstand something? Like, surely this was all intentional because he's protected me and all of these animals in my family. Like, I couldn't have misheard, right? But I wonder, like, over time, did Noah start to get discouraged? Did he start to wonder, like, am I ever going to get off this boat? The storm has passed. It's time to move on. Let's go. Let's rehabit the earth. Like, let's do something new, God. Like, why are you not speaking to me? Why are you ignoring me? Like, I think that's how I would feel if I were Noah. And I'm saying this, projecting, of course, because this is what I do, but also because a lot of that's how I felt after I went through a trauma, right? So I've shared before about the trauma that I went through, and it was literally probably 5 hours, like one night of my life, 5 hours of my entire life, I think, that I had calculated that I went through this, although it seemed like ages. But then the remnants lasted for so long. I had all of these, I had these flashbacks, I had emotions, I had a lot of disgust and anger and fear. I remember like I remember I was very scared to be around children in case they were harmed because I couldn't help them. And I remember this one time I was in Walmart and there was these two boys, they were probably junior high boys, standing in a toy aisle. And I walked past and I saw these two boys and I was filled with such anger at their parents for letting them be alone. Like, how could you even let your children out of your sight just for a minute? Like, one of them could just drop to the floor and like, can you save them? No, because you don't even know where they are. And I was so angry at these parents that I didn't know, because these two kids should have been able to be on their own, that I literally had to just leave the store. And that's what my life was like. It was like all of these things, that this fear and this anger was just controlling me day in and day out and day in and day out. So then God says, I want you to go get counseling. That was my boat. He said, I want you to go get counseling. I want you to go get help. So I got on the boat, but still, I was still processing through it. I was still dealing with all of these negative emotions and all of these thoughts and didn't know how to deal with it. But I actually want to turn to another passage because I want to speak specifically to God's timing. So I want to jump forward a little bit to Exodus 23. And this passage is where God is telling the Israelites what he has for them when they enter this promised land of rest. One thing to note, we talk about the promised land a lot. The promised land was already inhabited. People already lived there, but God had chosen that land for his people. And in part of that, he was intending in advance to drive out those enemies of his people. But I want to look specifically at the way he does that in Exodus 23. I will send my terror ahead of you and create panic among all the people whose lands you invade. I will make all your enemies turn and run. I will send terror ahead of you to drive out the Hivites, Canaanites, and Hittites. But I will not drive them out in a single year, because the land would become desolate and the wild animals would multiply and threaten you. I will drive them out a little at a time until your population has increased enough to take possession of the land. God's timing is part of his protection. In the case of the Israelites, he knew that he needed to drive out the enemies they could see slowly, so that way it could protect them from being overtaken by the enemies that they couldn't see. And so often in our lives, we do the same thing. We see an enemy, we see a threat, we see a storm, something right in front of us. It's there and it's present. And we're like, Lord, take it away. Get rid of it. Why are you going so slow? What are you doing? Can you even hear me? Why are you not speaking to me? But so often, God is taking the time to let the floodwaters recede slowly. Let our enemies be driven out slowly, because he knows that there are abundant threats and enemies out there, even beyond the storm that we can see. There are so many storms that we cannot see, and I believe he is protecting us from them so many times when we think he's just being slow. And it's the same with Noah, right? So obviously, if he could have even opened the ark of the door and gotten off before the floodwaters receded, he would have drowned. His family would have drowned. The animals would have drowned. None of us would have been here. He didn't really have a choice. He had to stay on the ark. But I think he would have chosen to anyway. He didn't seem to. Scripture doesn't tell us, so I'm just totally speculating all of this. But he is patient in sending out, I skipped over this part, but sending out a raven, sending out a dove, to check and see if the earth was safe for him to inhabit. He was patient and he was calm and he trusted God in all of this. And for me, in my case, I stayed in counseling as long as I needed to until God released me from it. I was still there and I was going every week or doing the assignments that she told me to do, because that's what God had directed me to. And I had to trust that his timing was part of his protection, even when it felt like torture. It was him protecting me. But there's one other thought that I want to share about this, and it's about the way that God appears to have been silent for a year. I know a lot of times in my life, when I'm going through a struggle, I feel like God is silent, that he's not speaking to me. Or maybe he does speak to me, but he's not answering the questions I'm asking, where I'm like, okay, did I do something wrong? Like, why are you not talking to me? Or why are you not answering this thing? So here's what I think that we are meant to do when we are in a situation like that. We do the last thing God told us to do. You just keep doing the last thing he told you to do. In Noah's case, it was getting on the boat. That was the last thing God told him to do until he told him to get off the boat. For me, what he told me to do was go get counseling. And I did it until he said, okay, now you're done. Now you can stop getting counseling. So what is it in your life? Is there something that God's told you to keep doing and then he was silent? Keep doing it. Whatever it was that he told you to do, keep doing it until he says stop. So I want to leave you with what I hope is an encouraging reminder, which is even if God is silent, he is still working. If God's timing seems to be slow, it's still perfect, and you can trust that it's for your protection. Because Scripture says that God works all things to our good and His glory, we can trust that He is always doing that, even when His timing, His agenda, His voice is not according to our schedule and according to our plans. He is still working on our good and on behalf of His glory. And the only thing that we have to do is the last thing that He told us to do. We don't have to try and devise a method to make the floodwaters recede on our own. We don't have to try to come up with a plan on how to drive out the enemies all at once while protecting us from wild animals. All we have to do is what He's told us to do, and we can trust that He will take care of the rest. The storm and all its floodwaters are out of our control anyway. Just know if God has called you into a storm, He will call you back out of that storm when the time is right. And you can trust Him to be working on your behalf and for the good of His glory as well.